May the words of my mouth and thoughts of my heart be acceptable before you, O God, my rock, my redeemer. Shalom all, and welcome, buenas noches, bienvenidos to our Kosher Torah Open Forum. I'm, of course, your host, Ariel Tzadok. You find me online at KosherTorah.com. We are presently in our series from the book Israel and Humanity by Rabbi Elijah ben Amozeg. This is our fourth class in this series. We are using as our textbook Israel and Humanity, the English translation from the Classics of Western Spirituality, readily available on Amazon.com. And if you do not already have the text, I would encourage you to please get it. And if you would be so kind as to click through Amazon from KosherTorah.com, because every time that you click to Amazon to purchase anything, you can buy your toilet paper or toothpaste. If you click through Kosher Torah, Amazon is gracious to give us a little bit of a kickback. It's one of the ways that you can support KosherTorah.com. Literally, anything and everything that you buy on Amazon.com, click through from Kosher Torah, the link prominently displayed on our front page. Anything and everything you buy there, it's registered that you came through us, and we get a kickback, and that's a way that you can support us. And again, I thank you very much for your support. But now, let's go back into our text. Israel and Humanity, as you know, very, very interesting proposition. An important mission that Rabbi Ben Amozeg is endeavoring to, I've actually subtitled this course, A Quest for Universal Torah. There is a fundamental issue that Rabbi Ben Amozeg is addressing throughout his entire text, and that is the message of what we call Judaism a subjective religion for the Jewish people, or is it a universal message for all humanity? And he is systematically outlining from Scripture and Judaic writings what exactly is the Torah message. Now, understand this within this context. We all know that the Bible, Torah, prophets speak of the Messianic era. And in the Messianic era, certain prophecies will be fulfilled. The, long-awaited, what's called in the book of Jeremiah, New Covenant. Christians have adopted the term and proclaim that that is their religion, and whatever. We're not here to fight and debate and argue. But yet, when you look at the words of Jeremiah, when he states that the new covenant will be that God's word will be etched upon the heart, everyone will know God, from the smallest and to the greatest, because the world will be filled with the knowledge of God. Needless to say, that day has not yet come, and therefore the new covenant cannot be said to be fulfilled, and that is why Judaism does not look at any proclamation of a new covenant in application at this time as having validity. But again, that's polemics, and we are not here to be polemic. What is this message? What is this universal message that all people will know from young and old? This is what we call the Torah of Mashiach. Now here's a very interesting little point. You see, the Kabbalists state that this Torah of Mashiach is actually nothing new, but rather something old. Indeed, the Torah of Mashiach was said to have been the original teachings of truth, justice, the original teachings of revelation, of experience of the spiritual realm. And in the section that we're going to begin discussing tonight, from page 86, Rabbi Ben Amozeg goes all the way back into Genesis. And he quotes here a discussion with regards to Abraham and his encounter meeting with Melchizedek. And now Melchizedek is said to be the priest of God Most High, possessor of the heavens and the earth. And Rabbi Ben Moshe brings down that this is a clear reference in Genesis to something which many of the biblical criticism school try to say is exclusive to Deuteronomy, which is that the concept of a universal God only began later. And he is saying, no, it began right from the beginning. And why is this important? It's important for a very important reason. If Moses is our author, and Moses is referencing an older tradition of the existence of a Most High God, the God of gods. Well, this is supposedly from an older tradition. Moses did not make it up. We went through our earlier classes where Rabbi Ben Moshe is saying that a lot of the concepts and ideas of monotheism, Moses might have learned from the Egyptian priesthood and adopted and brought it into Judaism and Torah. But yet, where did it come from before this? Now, we'll get a little interesting. If you'll allow me to quote the old Paul Harvey for the rest of the story. In Kabbalistic traditions, hotly debated by modern theoretical Kabbalists of the opinion of Chaim Vital, but warmly accepted and considered dogmatic by all the rest of the Kabbalists, Adam was not the first man. There was an entire civilization on earth prior to Adam. We call it the pre-Adamic civilization. And it was supposedly a very highly evolved and spiritual time. And what we would call the Torah of Mashiach was almost well known then. That entire epoch in time was what we would today call monotheistic. They knew, they experienced, and yet somehow something happened in that civilization which led to its demise. At that time, outside intervention occurred, which is the introduction of the Adamic spirit into the Homo sapien race, Adam. And yet, there was some type of sabotage, referred to in the Bible as the eating of the tree of knowledge, good and evil. And again, corruption occurred. But prior to this, there was a concept of complete singularity, in which everything was known to be a concentric whole. Modern science is now, through quantum theory and the like, beginning to understand that the nature of quantum entanglement is most likely a universal constant, in which everything is connected to everything else. This is exactly what the Bible means when it proclaims unity. But this is a problem now. Why? Because in our human reality, and I might add in our religious dogma, you might find the words spoken, but you don't find it brought into reality. Now, just over the weekend, I was debating with some of my students in the advanced class about certain Kabbalistic concepts and principles of the relationship of God through different filters, which we call in the Kabbalah language the Partsufim. We covered this in the basic Kabbalistic concepts and terminology series. And I threw a curve to them from left field, saying that a lot of the ideas and concepts of these, if you will, gradients within the divine have their origins in Greek philosophy, a la Plato, Plotinus, and the Neoplatonics, and the like. So much is this so, that when you look at the evolution and the development of the Christian concept of the Trinity, it is actually based upon these Greek concepts. And the problem that exists here is, even though something can have a source from point A, those who lose contact with point A never see the relationship and twist and turn and tumble and fall, and in the end, like in the old game of telephone, you have created something so completely different from what originally existed. So, those of you with any background in Christianity, if you read the Apostolic or the Nicene Creeds already from the 3rd century, radically different from the ideas and concepts of Trinity discussion from earlier centuries, most of which by these creeds was declared heretical by the church. But this is all the idea and concept and doctrine of theology, philosophy, and the like. The Greeks had this doctrine, this idea, which many believe is even on the other side of the world, shared by none less than Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras, when he makes the difference between the Purusha and the Prakriti, that there are two realities in the world, the spiritual and the physical, and never the twain shall meet. The spiritual is all high and good and lofty, and the physical is all lowly, disgusting, and bad. Well, guess what? That is absolutely not what our Torah teaches. Indeed, Rabbi Ben Mosek picks up on this, and on page 86 he states, "For the Gentiles, heaven and earth have different and often hostile gods." He says, we know that even in Christianity, earth is constantly in a state of theological alienation from heaven. But for Judaism, the heavens and the earth form a single realm, the domain of the same God. Now this is a vital foundational point in understanding religion. Because to this very day, anything that has come out of the Grecian model of duality, and this is very clearly the foundation also seen in Zohar. Yes, for those who want to believe the continuing fantasy that Shimon Bar Yochai wrote the Zohar, I think there's enough, scholarly evidence to disqualify that. But, fanaticism and fundamentalism die hard. And people aren't open to truth. They just want to believe what they want. Believe what you want. I don't care. But the concepts that you see in the Zohar, and when you see scholars throughout decades and centuries say, this sounds really Neoplatonic, they got a point. And that point is this concept of duality. That there is this good and evil, and that they are duking it out with one another. This is not the foundational Torah teaching. Is there good? Yes. Is there evil? Yes. Is there light? Yes. Is there darkness? Yes. But there is no God versus the devil fighting over your soul. That is a myth. And in that respect, the message of Judaism, like it says in Isaiah 45:7, God is the author of light, God is the author of darkness, God is the author of good, God is the author of evil. And this is a vital point in understanding both God and man. Rabbi Ben Mosek goes into a very interesting discussion here. Let me read to you this on the bottom of page 86. I'm just going to read it to you and I'll comment when I'm done. He says, after describing the creation of the world, the Bible recounts that of man, but in terms which leaves no doubt about our belief in the unique God. At the very start we read of a command given to mankind, which is repeated after the flood. It's both a promise and a blessing as well. Fill the earth, subdue it, hold sway over all the animals which inhabit it. This God, for who the sake of man disposes in the way of other beings which he has just created, is thus clearly the absolute master. The author of Psalm 8 must have had access to the contents of Genesis, or at any rate echoed the same tradition. The grandeur of creation draws from a cry of pity for man, who is nevertheless so favored by God that he is only slightly less than Elohim. An allusion, no doubt, either to the words of Genesis 1:27, in the image of Elohim, God, he created him, or those of Genesis 3:5, but God knows that as soon as you eat of it, the forbidden fruit, your eyes will be open and you will be like Elohim, who knows good and bad. Or perhaps God's words in the same vein after the fall, now that man has become like one of us, knowing good and bad. The psalmist is obviously recalling the distinction conferred upon Adam. In the passage from Genesis just cited, you have made a master over your handiwork, laying the world at his feet. The human race, Adam, the unique significance of this extraterrestrial sentience that embodied Homo sapiens, raising and creating what we know as the Adamic spirit, is a spark of God. And just as the singularity exists in all being and everything in creation, so that semblance of consciousness exists within every single human soul. And every single human soul is a mirror reflection of the singularity. So therefore you will find in mystical literature, man is called the microcosm of the universal macrocosm. You can dismiss this and say this is all just theory and philosophy. But no, it is far much more than that. How? Because it is speaking of the importance of our humanity, and how important it is that we recognize our own importance and respect it in one another. Judaism has always proclaimed the message of morality, righteousness, dignity, the concepts that were embraced by the first English philosophers and then American founding fathers, concepts like life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal. Granted, these things might not have been honored or executed as they should have been in the American example, but the words and the sentiment were correct, and still are. Where did this concept of this supremacy of our humanity come from? Right here in our Bible. God is number one, but man is number two. One reflects the other. And that is why this is important. Because when God is respected, you will find so is our fellow man. When God is disrespected, so is our fellow man. Think about it. When people have a true honor and respect for God, they'll have a true honor and respect for each other. And when one is lacking, so is the other. That's just the reality of things. God governs His world, He's in charge, but yet humanity always plays a role. Now, this message here. Rabbi Ben Moshe gets into a very interesting discussion, bottom page 87, continuing here, about the mission of Israel. He goes in the top page 88, he quotes from Exodus chapter 19, verse 5, where it states, "Now then, if you will obey me faithfully, keep my covenant, You shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine. A God whose dominion is universal could never be exclusively a national divinity, as rationalist criticism maintains. I've long heard from many people who wanted to claim that Hashem, Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh, was just a tribal deity of Israel. Indeed, when you read in the books of Judges, Samuel, the Philistines, who would always fight against Israel, always believed that Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh was the god of the mountains, and that he protected the Israelites in the hills and the mountains. But if they, the Philistines, could drag the Israelites out of the mountains down into the valleys, that is where their God had power, and therefore they'd be able to defeat the Israelites. That was the concept. You read about that, that's clearly in the Bible. We all would chuckle at that today, but in those days, that is not only what a lot of the Philistines believed, but your average everyday Israelite, even though he might have heard differently, did he really believe it? Judging from the overlapping of idolatry within the days of the First Temple period, both the tabernacle time all the way through the Babylonian exile, these overlapping ideas and beliefs were very, very common. People needed to evolve and grow, and that is what is important to understand. So you see, was Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh a tribal god of the Israelites? Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh said no. But it took a period of evolution for the concept to develop, not only in the written scripture, but also to sink down into the collective mindset of the nation. Now, let's take our time machine and go back. Let's not talk to Moses and Aaron. They had a little bit more knowledge than your average rank and file. Let's not even talk to David or Solomon. Let's go and speak to your average Israelite in the day and say, what do you know about the God of Israel? Tell us your theology. Well, number one, they would never heard the word theology. Would they have called him the creator of the heavens and the earth and the things that we know from Genesis and others? Judging from the words of Psalms, we would say, yes. People say the same thing today. But guess what? Just like today, people proclaim the message of universality but don't embrace it because they live in the duality, it's exactly the way it was 2,000, 3,000 years ago. In other words, psychologically, people were the same. And that is a profound revelation. Excuse me. Rabbi Ben Moseg references Genesis chapter 4, where he speaks of the days of the sons of Adam, where it says, in those days, this was the time when men began to invoke the Lord by name, which is indicative in the words of our sages that this is when idolatry began. Meaning, the concept of looking at other forces of being as having influence over humanity. Now here is a very important issue. Are there really other gods? Rabbi Ben Moshe goes into a long discussion about this. He makes understandings of this. We're going to get into a number of these different things, but what he mentions here by referencing Genesis 4, again echoes back that prior to this time, knowledge of the singularity was paramount. Now, for those who read just the superficial reading of an English translation of the Bible, they never ever address the important questions. So, for example, we all know, well, according to a simplistic reading, Adam was the first man, Eve the first woman. Yes? Yes. There was no one else, no other human beings. Then along came Adam, then along came Cain and Abel. And then it says that Cain killed Abel. So now there's only 3 human beings left. And then the next thing it knows, it says Cain's getting married and having kids. Nowhere in Genesis does it record where Cain found his wife from. Jewish legend does, but the Bible doesn't. So for the literalists who do not want to accept an oral tradition, there are numerous openings, pits, which they can fall. Clear places in which things are left out of the story. There were numerous people in the days of Adam. An entire populated world. And it was all monotheistic. And then something changed. It was a psychological evolution. This is what we can call the history of religion. Most people, when it came to understanding idols, if you see people making an idol, do they really consider the idol itself to be their God? No. They consider it to be a representative image. You have people who are idol makers, and they darn well know that that's not the God, but they say it's an image of the God. And here is the problem. We know from the second commandment, God said, "You shall have no other gods upon my face," meaning no imagery. Why? Because God's name, and I'm kind of jumping ahead in the text here, and so be it. The issue is that God's identity as active being, because that's what the name YHWH actually means, reality, is beyond any semblance of imagination. In the language of the Kabbalah, we say that God's ultimate essence has no form, no semblance of form, not even a letter, not even a name. Indeed, YHWH as a name is only an expression of the unknowableness of God. It's not actually God's true essence. It's a revelation of what God reveals to existence, not which is above. But that's going into other areas. Ultimately and originally, based upon this concept, people said, okay, well, if God's the unknowable, God reveals himself through all these multiple forms and ways, well, gee whiz, we can easily just pick up this idea, that idea, projected it to this form and this image, and by doing so, I am focusing on the ultimate singularity, but I am taking a subdivision of the singularity and focusing on that specific subdivision, because that's what I need. I need to contact God as the bringer of rain. I need to contact God as the healer. So when God is performing the rainmaking, we call him the rainmaker. And when he is performing healing, we call him the healer. So therefore, I'm going to make a little image and an icon, a little visual reminder. God the rainmaker, and another one over there, God the healer. So when I want to pray for rain, I'm going to visualize in this little form of the rainmaker. You know, sometimes my mind, I'm such an old guy here, I can't figure out. So I'm going to carve myself a little stone or a little wooden image. Call it God the Rainmaker. And I'm going to make another one over there and I'm going to call it God the Healer. Just to help my poor little mind here think. What happens then? I might be doing such things with the most innocence of mind. But then the second and third and future generations come and say, okay, we got God the Rainmaker, and there's other God the Healer, and you forget that it's ultimately one and the same. And this is how the diversity and the division came about, which led to the concept of foreign gods. Let this not confuse us with regards to the angelic hierarchy of what we'll call spiritual government. That is something else. We'll get to that later. But the issue is here one of a confusion, a mistake of the intellect, wherein which people put an image upon God's face, which does not belong there. And almost everybody today, including Orthodox Jews, do exactly this. Whatever you want to say about God is fundamentally wrong. God is love. No, He's not. God is just. No, He's not. Well, how dare I say that? Oh, God manifests Himself as in love. God can manifest Himself in justice. Yes, I agree. And yet God can manifest Himself in everything. Isaiah 45:7. He said this before. But understand now the nature, the psychology of idolatry. Because this is a fundamental constant, a blemish in the human mode of thinking that causes continual problems in our collective humanity. And in order to help understand this, I have another lengthy quote that I wish to bring down to you from a famous psychoanalyst by the name of Erich Fromm. He's the author of a very famous book called The Art of Loving. Can't recommend Freud's stuff. Erich Fromm. I can't recommend his stuff enough. Great guy. His book entitled Psychoanalysis and Religion. In my version, on page 114, I'm going to read to you literally almost 2-3 pages here, because he has such a profound understanding of what this message is, and it's such an excellent hand-in-glove compliment to Rabbi Ben Amol-Zeg. And it's important for us, because to think of YHWH as a tribal god or just the god of Judaism, no. To think that there is some kind of a duality, no. To think that there's some kind of a division, no. Listen to the words of Erich Fromm, and I quote, "From a strictly monotheistic standpoint, the use of the word God constitutes a problem. The Bible insists that man must not attempt to make an image of God in any form. Undoubtedly, one aspect of this injunction is that of a taboo guarding the awesomeness of God. But another aspect, however, is the idea that God is a symbol of all that which is within man, and yet which man is not. A symbol of a spiritual reality that we can strive to realize in ourselves, and yet can never describe or define. God is like the horizon, which sets the limitations of our sight. To the naive mind, it seems to be something real which can be grasped. Yet to seek the horizon is to seek a mirage. When we move, the horizon moves. When we climb even a low hill, the horizon becomes wider. But it still remains a limitation, and never is a thing to be taken hold of. The idea that God cannot be defined is clearly expressed in the biblical story of God's revelation to Moses. Moses charged with the task of speaking to the children of Israel, leading them from bondage to freedom, yet knowing the spirit of serfdom and idolatry in which they lived, said to God, "Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, I shall say to them, the God of your fathers had said unto them, right? The God of your fathers sent me unto you, and they shall ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? God said to Moses, I am that I am. And he said, thus shall you say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. The meaning of these words become clearer if we pay close attention to the Hebrew text. I am that I am, YHWH, would translated more correctly in the tense used in the original, I am being that I am being. Moses asks God for a name, because a name is something one can grasp and worship. And God, throughout the whole story of the Exodus, made loving concessions to the idolatrous state of mind of the children of Israel. And so he also makes the concession of telling Moses his name. But there's profound irony in this name. It expresses the process of being rather than something finite that could be named like a thing. The meaning of the text would accurately be rendered if it were translated, my name is nameless. Ever think about that? Ein Sof. Okay, I'm digressing here. For those of you who are familiar with the Tao Te Ching of Lhasa, the opening words were the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The name of God that can be named is not the eternal name. It's not God. Same concept. It was universal. Let's go back to Dr. Fromm, and I quote again. In the development of Christian and Jewish theology, we find repeated attempts to achieve a purer concept of God by avoiding even a trace of positive descriptions or definition of God. We see this in Plotinus, in Maimonides, as the great German mystic Master Eckhart put it, that which one says is God, he is not. That which one does not say of him is more truly than that which one does say he is. From the standpoint of monotheism carried through to its logical consequences, there can be no argument about the nature of God. No man can presume to have any knowledge of God which permits him to criticize or condemn his fellow man, or to claim his own idea of God is the only right one. Remember what we said? What can you really say about God? If God is the Ein Sof and the great unknowable, the nameless, how can we sit and argue and bicker, thump our chests and say, my God's bigger than your God, my God's bigger than yours? Old children say that's very childish. My religion's better than yours. Many years, I myself was in that, in my opinion, mistaken motif. When we were in the battle of fighting the missionaries and all the rest, we don't have to fight missionaries. They have their beliefs, we have ours. We disagree. That's it. We're going to fight to the last man. What the last man standing wins? Doesn't work like that now, does it? Okay? This is not the right way. Let me go back to Dr. Fromm, and again I quote, the religious intolerance so characteristic of Western religions, which springs from such claims, and psychologically speaking, stems from lack of faith or lack of love, has had a devastating effect on religious development. It has led to a new form of idolatry. An image of God, not in wood and stone, but in words. It's erected so that people worship at its shrine. Isaiah has criticized this distortion of monotheism in these words, and I quote, Isaiah 58, 3-6. Wherefore have you fasted, say they, thou seest not? Wherefore have we afflicted our soul, and thou takest no knowledge? Behold, in the day of your fast you find pleasure, and exact all your labors. Behold, you fast for strife and debate, and to smite with the fist of wickedness. Shall not fast as you do this day, to make your voice to be heard on high? Is it such a fast that I have chosen? A day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head as a bulrush, and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast and an acceptable day to God? Is not this the fast that I have chosen? To loosen the bands of wickedness, undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, that you break every yoke. Is not to deal your bread to the hungry, that thou bring the poor that are cast out of thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou you cover him, that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh? Then shall thy light shine as the morning, thy health shall spring forth speedily, thy righteousness go forth before thee, and the glory of Hashem shall be thy reward. Forgive all the these and the thous, but that's the version he breaks down. He is quoting Isaiah, and Isaiah's condemnation of what we would today call in Hebrew chumrot, strict religious interpretations which contradict the basic concepts of morality and human dignity, which, if you remember, we just said is second only to the respect of God. People claim how they're respecting God when they disrespect their fellow man, and therefore are exposing themselves to disrespecting God. That is how come we can say that such expressions of religion is hypocritical, is cultic, and fundamentally wrong. When you burn bridges, you create cults. When you build bridges, you reconnect the singularity, the original Adamic mission, the original teachings of the Ten Commandments, the whole purpose of what we call the Torah of Mashiach. That's what kosher Torah is all about. Let me continue reading Fromm, because it gets better. He says the Old Testament, especially the prophets, are as much concerned with the negative, the fight against idolatry, as they were with the positive, the recognition of God. Are we still concerned with the problem of idolatry? Only when we find that certain primitives worship idols of wood and stone do we show such concern. We picture ourselves as being far above such worship, and as having solved the problems of idolatry, because we do not see ourselves worshipping any of these traditional symbols of idolatry. We forget that the essence of idolatry is not the worship of this or that particular idol, but is a specifically human attitude. This attitude may be described as the deification of things, of partial aspects of the world, and man's submission to such things, in contrast to an attitude in which his life is devoted to the realization of the highest principles of life, those of love, reason, to the aim of becoming what he potentially is, a being made in the likeness of God. It is not only pictures in stone and wood that are idols. Words can become idols. And machines can become idols. Leaders, the state, power, political groups may also serve. Science, the opinions of one's neighbors can become idols. And God has become an idol for many. While it is not possible for man to make valid statements about the positive, about God, it is possible to make statements about the negative, about idols. Is it not time to cease to argue about God, and instead to unite in the unmasking of contemporary forms of idolatry? Today it is not Baal or Ashtar, but the deification of the state, and I'll throw in deification of rabbis, religion, of the power in authoritarian countries, the deification of machines and of success in our own culture, which threaten the precious spiritual possessions of man. End of quote. You think that you could separate, split things out, but that is not what it's all about. Ultimately, God alone, in the heavens above, the earth below, there is no other. Deuteronomy 4:39, found on page 90 in Rabbi Ben Mosek. Okay? He is the transcendent and the immanent. It's a forceful way of asserting his oneness. See then that I am He. There is no God beside me. I deal death, give life. I wound, I heal. None can be delivered from my hand. Deuteronomy 32:39. Both prosperity and misfortune, death as well as life, belong to God alone. Rabbi Ben Moshe then brings down a very interesting issue. Well, hold on. I want to quote you what he says here first. He states here that this concept is altogether consistent with the spirit of Judaism, which, and he quotes here Spinoza, who, according to many Orthodox Jews, is a heretic, but Rabbi Ben Moshe apparently not. That Spinoza, amongst others, observed, and do not shrink from acknowledging God to be the author of every natural phenomena, whether it be welcomed or baneful. And this is without any of the embarrassing hedging which modern theodicies bring to the problem of evil. Such indeed was the domination of the monotheism of the ancient Jews, that it never occurred to them that they could offend the unique God by declaring Him creator of everything, good and evil. And now he brings down the famous episode in Leviticus 16, the offering of the goat, scapegoat, to Azazel. Many people read this story and totally misunderstand it. They think that because there are two goats, there is one goat which is being sacrificed and offered to God, and a second equal goat which is being sacrificed and offered to Azazel. There's our duality, right? One goat goes to God, one goat goes to Azazel, who we call the devil. Really? Really? Are you saying, now remember something, this is a divine command. Are you interpreting Leviticus as saying that God commanded the high priest in the temple, in the sanctuary, to offer a sacrifice to the devil? Devil worship? Ordered by God? Obviously, those people who want to read scripture like that are really missing something big. Let's get simple to understand it. Number one, there was never an offering to Azazel. It doesn't say that. The goat goes out to the desert. But both goats were offered only to God. Both goats were offered to God. Good and evil. One has one fate, one has another fate, but both are offered to the same source. It's no offering to the devil, to Azazel, or anything of the kind. God set up the system. Both goats are offered to Hashem. Right? Yes, one goes one way, one goes the other. Because God created a universe in which, if you really want to understand the nature of it, the best image that I can give you, which is not an idolatrous image, and shame on any racist, prejudiced individual who would think otherwise. I am visualizing the symbol known in the Orient as the Yin and the Yang. And I have had, in all due respect, people who I cannot respect. Who say, oh, it's an idolatrous image. What's idolatrous about it? It's no more idolatrous than the stars and stripes in the American flag, or the star and the bar in the Israeli flag. It's an image, it's a symbol. And it reflects a reality which is very valid. If you're familiar with Yin and Yang, they look like two parts, like almost teardrops, which fit into each other nicely. One's black, one's white, and they form a concentric hole. We have this same concept in the Kabbalah of the Ari. We call it Ma and Ben. The rectifier with the rectified. Male and female and all the rest of that jazz. There is always this duality. But the duality is not the ultimate reality. Why must there be a duality? Because in duality there is movement. Movement creates life. That's what a rolling wheel is. If you're familiar, if you can visualize the Yin Yang symbol, you have one side which is large, one side which is small. And in the large side, you have a little dot which represents, if you will, the birth of the other side. So, you always have movement, like day and night. And you always have this process of movement. Everything is in movement. Science recognizes and knows that even at the atomic level, atoms, molecules, everything is vibrating. Most recent, best to my knowledge, physics or theories of physics, what we call the string theory, the theory of how everything fits together, and supposedly these little vibrating movement, little energies, which give rise to everything. This helps us explain why. Like it says in Kohelet Ecclesiastes, there is a time and a purpose for all things under heaven. Remember, a time to be born, a time to die. Go listen to the song from the birds. Why is this important to emphasize? Because we forget to see the thread that sews it all together, and we look at the individual isolated things, thinking that each one is separate, and possibly a separate God, or separate force, which each one has to be interact with individually, or pacified, or prayed to separately. And this is where the ideas and concepts and mistakes of pantheism comes from. That is such a profound point. For the longest time, in my limited knowledge of Hinduism, I always believed that ultimately Hinduism was a pantheistic expression. I see all these, pantheon of gods. And I met with swamis from that tradition who swore to me that they were monotheistic. I thought that was the most fundamentally wrong thing that could possibly be. How could you say that? And then they introduced me to their ideas and their concepts and their beliefs. And I had to say, oh, I get it. I don't know if the rank and file people, they get it. Any more rank and file Jewish people get our religion. That's a failure, if you will, maybe on our parts as teachers. That's why I find it so vital, so important, that we put this material out, like we would say a Shulchan Aruch, a set table, so that everything can be clear and understood. Because that is what's so important. We must understand the singularity that underlies the diversity. Because if we lose sight of the source, then we lose sight of all. Okay. Rabbi Ben Amolzeg, on page 93, gets into a very interesting discussion of the nature of historical Israel. And he writes here something interesting. Listen to this. Torah law provides evidence of an unmistakable intention to isolate the Jews from all peoples, no doubt to ensure the preservation of their peculiar identity. But this isolation would only make sense if it were a question of protecting some grand principle which might be compromised by contact with the pagans. To which people might say, aha, well there you go. If we come in contact with those pagans, we're going to be contaminated by them. There you go, good and evil, black and white. Separate. Wrong. How so? Because you must understand the nature and the purpose of what the separation. Why, historically, did God say, I want you to be a nation to stay by yourself? And yet later said that you're supposed to be a light to the nations. I don't know anybody today in the world, including myself, who in honesty, in sincerity can say, look at Judaism today in its present form. Look at the state of Israel today in its present form. And this is the role model of the highest expression of all good in the world. Anybody who would ever say that, in my opinion, is a liar. Because it's just fundamentally not true. Israel today is as a corrupt state as any other. Judaism today as a religion is unfortunately as compromised as any other. But it wasn't supposed to be like this. What was it that's supposed to be like? Let me share with you some insights from Jungian psychology, from a book called The Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament, by a very prominent Jungian teacher, Edward Edinger. Chapter 7. He quotes here with regards to Joshua going into the Promised Land. Remember, this is the time of the Torah when God said, separate from the Canaanites and all the rest. This is what Dr. Edinger writes, page 65. He says, the Promised Land was a gift from, he calls God Yahweh, Hashem, to the Israelites. And yet, it had to be conquered. It was not a gift freely given, which the receiver may accept or decline. It was a command to take the land of Canaan. And those who declined were destroyed. Numbers 14:37. Psychologically, the Promised Land can be seen as the area of the unconscious, which the imperative or individuation requires to be assimilated by the ego. This area is specifically assigned to the ego by the higher self, but still must be conquered by the efforts of the ego. The land is not vacant, but occupied. It's studded with fortified cities, meaning it contains defended unconscious complexes, which must be resolved before it can be assimilated. Joshua's conquest of Canaan is a symbolic picture of how to deal with the unconscious and its hostile complexes under certain circumstances. He continues, and he states here with regards to all of the violence at the time, page 69, that resort to such extreme measures reflects the dangerous nature of all Canaanite things to invading Israel. Because at that time, Israel is in the process of establishing its identity. Not only must it conquer the land of Canaan, but it also must impose its identity on the land. There are many historical examples of a country's conquering culturally its physical conquerors. Similarly, in the psychology of the individual, there are times of transition when it may be fatal to allow any consideration for a standpoint one is trying to overcome. An all or nothing condition must prevail. Only thus is the connection with the self preserved. This is an evolutionary state which, once established, you move on from. So you see, psychologically, that state of either or, that's a very adolescent state. We see this as the psychological state of the adolescent, wherein which when a child reaches puberty, they go through that rebellious teenage state, wherein which they have to say to the parent, no, I am not you, I am me. And they look to discover their identity. In such a time and in such a state, it is vital that the concept of individuality be explored and discovered. Well, that is what was going on in ancient Israel. They had to find themselves as a nation. And God told them, separate yourselves so that you could focus on this and maintain the grand principle of this universality, which is God. And then, whether the people were ready or not, God took it to the next step and scattered the people to the four corners of the earth. The sages of Israel, the rabbis, they knew so well what they were doing. They recognized and knew that Israel had to perform a dual function, a yin and a yang. They had to be in the world, but not of it. That is why the rabbis created the hedge around the law, to create a cultural expression which would clearly demarcate and identify the people, which created a sense of separation, which enabled them to have the safety of the development of the concepts, the philosophy, the spirituality of what Torah, the universal message, the being of Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh, was to be. And yet at the same time they lived right next door to their non-Jewish neighbors, who were always peeking over, if you will, the top of the wall, looking at these Jewish books, translating them into Greek, Arabic, Latin, and many of it became the foundation of a lot of the teachings of Western philosophy and Western theology. That's just a funny way how God works. The author of good and evil, light and darkness, and how He works to merge all things together as one. We have run out of time. We've even gone over a little bit. Oops. Oh well, so what? It's important that we stay focused on what the message is and that we understand it in proper depth. So I want you to actually sit back and repeat this. Go back, read the texts. If you can even pick up Edinger or Fromm, read these things inside. Understand what the message is. And take away from this the message of tolerance, the message of respect, the message that each and every human being, whenever we think of them, him or her, they're created in God's image. And if they're living a lifestyle or acting in a way, as long as they're not harming another, it's their business. Our business is to try to cultivate the best in everyone, because that is the proper and true way to honor God, and the true and proper way to fulfill ourselves as being created in that image of God. Let's conclude on that note. Thank you again for joining me tonight. I'm your host, Ariel Tzadok. Come see me online at KosherTorah.com. Thank you again. Thank you for your continuous support. God bless. Good night. Buenas noches. Shalom. 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 Good night. Buenas noches. Shalom.